Hey everyone, welcome back to the Ask the Educator podcast. This is your host, Kevin Anderson, and with me, as always, Adam Okada. And for this episode, this one is in following our one of our international webinars. We have a special guest. His name is Mark Hodgson. He has over 35 years of experience in healthcare and infection prevention. He is a chemist with a strong background in environmental microbiology. He has led quality driven programs, developed training initiatives, and shaped corporate policies. Mark has worked as a regulatory liaison, expert witness, and outbreak investigator, specializing in disinfection, risk assessment, and prevention strategies. His research spans cutting edge disinfection technologies, including vaporized hydrogen peroxide and accelerated hydrogen peroxide systems. So I know that's kind of an abbreviated bio, and Mark, we've already talked. I know you don't really care, but it's good for people to who are tuning in to kind of understand a little bit about your background and why we have you as a guest. But Mark, welcome to the show. Let us know. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, other than what I just read. How about tell us about your experience with Central Sterile?
Well, thanks, Kevin. It's a great intro. Um, and you kind of touched on my passion, and my passion is patient safety, which is driven by, in my case, using chemistry to help eliminate pathogens from the environment. And pathogens are everywhere, uh, they're a fact of life. And obviously, the idea of central sterile is we're supposed to make equipment. We're supposed to make devices sterile and safe for use. Um, and they come in from the operating room. They're dirty. They have potentially high risk pathogens on them. They've got pathogens on them, but potentially high risk, and we want to get rid of those. And one of the things that I now work on a lot is making sure that we don't put in a huge amount of effort trying to clean, sterilize, sanitize something, and then incidentally and accidentally recontaminate it. So that's one of the things we shall definitely be talking about today. It's one of the things that I look at. And the other one is that with the impact of biofilms and the often underappreciated impact of biofilms, again, all that effort that everyone puts in to clean and sterilize often goes to waste because if you don't address the bacteria in the biofilm, then you don't get rid of the biofilm. Don't get rid of the bacteria, sorry. So,
No, and you're if by the way, if you haven't checked out Mark's February webinar, go to our Academy page, academy.hmark.com, and check it out. It is an amazing, has some amazing visuals on biofilm, explaining biofilms. But for our podcast listeners, um, can you give us kind of a background on what biofilm is and why it is such a danger in a healthcare environment?
sure. Uh, it's really simple. Biofilm is something that bacteria, mostly, also fungi, also protozoans, make to protect themselves from the rigors of the environment. A harsh environment is not a good place for a bacteria to grow. Um, they're subject to dehydration. They're impacted by UV radiation. They're impacted by chemistry, all of which make it difficult for a bacteria to thrive and survive. So what they do is they excrete this stuff, which we call extrapolymeric substance, EPS. Um, that's a mixture. It's got a little bit of genetic material in there. It's got some protein structures. It's got some polysaccharide structures, and it's got moisture, water. And that forms a housing or a coating in which these bacteria are going to live. And it's sticky so that it attracts nutrients. You can have multiple species of bacteria in there. You can have bacteria plus fungi plus viruses, all living happily cohabiting within this biofilm. And what it does is it means that the bacteria survive for way longer than we would otherwise think. Yeah. If you look at the textbooks, it'll tell you things like Klebsiella survives for 8 to 10 days on a surface. Well, I did one study with a Klebsiella pneumoniae, um, and at the end of 1,300 days, the Klebsiella in the biofilm was still quite happily living and reproducing. And the only reason we stopped was we ran out of grant money to do the study. So, we could easily say 1,300 days, but it could be a lot more. So,
Yeah.
Wow.
because the bacteria survives for so much longer, obviously it puts people at so much more risk. It doesn't just go away. The other thing is many of the disinfecting products that we use on a routine basis simply do not penetrate biofilm and therefore do not provide us with a good kill of the bacteria and viruses that are inside that biofilm.
So I want to go a little bit off script if you don't mind, and maybe you have answers to these or not. And Adam, maybe you can pick up after I go off script here. But I thought of a couple questions while you were explaining those things. And one of them that kind of comes up pretty commonly in discussions about biofilm as it relates to central sterile or sterile processing, whatever you want to call it, is how long does it take for a biofilm to develop? I've heard definite different answers for that, but and maybe it depends on the bacteria or the species or the type or whatever. Maybe there's some variation there, but is there in general some amount of time that a biofilm takes to develop?
Um, well, the answer to your question is the standard how long is a piece of string? Every single one of the variables you mentioned
Sure.
impact the development of biofilm. Um, so the species does definitely, even the strain and the subspecies, um, the conditions, how much moisture is available, how much nutrient is available. Are there any other organic stresses? Are there any other species? All impact the production rate. However, what everybody wants to really know is how quickly does it start? Yes? And the
Sure.
answer to that can be as quickly as 20 to 40 minutes.
Okay.
Now, in 20 to 40 minutes, you don't get a mature biofilm. You know, when we try to grow a mature biofilm in something like the CDC reactor, generally that's going to take us 24 to 48 hours. Okay. But that is a full, 8 to 9 log biofilm. That's a fully mature, all singing, all dancing material. But that process of starting the production of the extrapolymeric substance, pretty much as soon as the bacteria settles on a surface, it's going to get loose cohesion. It's almost an electrostatic attachment. But as soon as that attachment occurs, it's going to start producing EPS.
Gotcha. And then one sort of follow up to that is one of the most common disinfectants that we use in sterile processing is actually hot water in an automated washer disinfector. And I'm just curious, is there any studies or any information on how effective that thermal disinfection process is in terms of breaking up a biofilm?
Uh, Biofilm insulates as well as everything else. So it slows and reduces the heat transfer onto the surface. Biofilm, I have seen biofilm responsible for preventing a steam sterilizer from working properly.
Oh,
So heat helps. Heat is good. We all love heat, but at the end of the day, um, biofilm reduces the overall efficacy of heat, means you have to keep it heated for a longer period. Um, One of the best examples I can probably give you of that is something like Legionella bacteria. And if you look at Legionella bacteria in a biofilm, the classic temperature cutoff is 60 degrees. Well, if you run water at 70 degrees and you got Legionella in a biofilm, the stuff at the bottom of that biofilm will survive.
Wow. I mean, that's just it's really incredible, some of the data on biofilm and just how hard it is to get rid of once it's on a surface. And especially, in a sterile processing setting, all of our surfaces are going to be soiled with something, and we just do a quick wipe down with a disinfectant wipe and we just assume everything's perfect after that. But these biofilms are a lot more hardy. One thing that I really took away from your webinar was this idea of persister cells. Can you give a little bit of an explanation to the listeners on what persister cells are in a biofilm and why they make it so difficult to kill a biofilm?
Right. So a persister cell is one of the colony of bacteria that are in the biofilm, and it has been instructed, chemically instructed, by the other bacteria to become 100% dormant. So, in other words, there's nothing going on with that cell. It is just sitting there. And the reason that's a challenge is normally, as somebody who manufactures disinfectants or designs disinfectants, what you always try and do is create a chemistry that the bacteria is going to recognize as something it thinks it wants. And then an active bacteria will actually transport that chemistry across its cellular membrane, helping kill itself. So if you look at something simple, hydrogen peroxide, or say chlorine hypochlorous acid, um, both of those molecules are very similar in shape actually to water. And the bacteria is not smart enough to distinguish and will latch on to those molecules, transport them through its membrane, and kill themselves. Whereas a dormant bacteria obviously doesn't do that. Um, so that's why persister cells are so much of a challenge because you may be able to kill all the other bacteria in that biofilm. But if you leave the persisters behind, what happens is obviously they immediately go from dormant to active, and 20 to 40 minutes later have rebuilt the biofilm you're trying to break down.
Ugh. So that that definitely speaks to why they're so difficult. So how how is it how does this impact a little bit with the drain lines and how biofilms are able to survive in them and um are the biofilms in the drain lines, how do they escape or can they, or how do they
Oh,
impact us?
they can definitely escape. So what I mean, the natural assumption is that we use that sink as we're scrubbing something or simply as a disposal mechanism to flush waste away. And the assumption is always that once it goes down the drain line, that's it, bye bye, it's gone. Unfortunately, that is simply not true. The drain line itself is normally an inch and a half to 2 inch pipe. Um, all of those surfaces on the inside of the drain line are constantly wet, and therefore you will have constant bacterial growth. And if you flush a pathogen into that drain line, it is going to adhere to the side. It's going to grow biofilm. And what's more, it's going to grow biofilm incredibly rapidly. There was one wonderful experiment that I saw done where somebody seeded the P-trap, the bit at the bottom of that drain, and then just poured in a little bit of nutrient. And the biofilm grew up the pipe at the rate of almost an inch a day, 2.2 centimeters a day, as this thing grows up, back up the pipeline. So the first thing is it's growing back up the pipeline. But the other thing is, as soon as you turn on the faucet and you run the water and you see that swirling water disappearing down the drain line, unfortunately, what that does is it disturbs the biofilm, it breaks it up a little, and it creates an aerosol that then comes back up
Spread.
the drain line. And that aerosol will happily contain all the pathogen that was in the drain and will spread it easily 2 meters. We had an incident in a hospital recently where the patient was roughly 2.5 meters from the sink, the hand washing sink, but still managed to get infected by Stenotrophomonas um, with a respiratory infection. So clearly that was an inhalation. Um, the
Oh,
challenge is we don't allow for what is essentially a dirty aerosol coming back up the drain line. And we think we've got our hands clean. We think we've got our tools clean. We think all of the stuff that we've just spent all that time sterilizing and processing is clean. And then you run the faucet, and the aerosol will simply generate bacteria that will happily settle onto whatever it is you've just finished working on.
you know what? That makes a lot of sense when you say that because we talk a lot about here at Healthmark, we talk a lot about shavers and try and educate people on orthopedic shavers and how difficult they are to clean. And part of that is not being able to see on the inside of them. But I don't know if you're aware of this, but in 2009, they were actually linked to shoulder scope patients developing SSIs. And um, uh, one of the things they discovered, or at least kind of think might have been the cause, was bacteria from um, inside the decontamination sink getting onto the debris inside the shaver and then hanging on for dear life during the subsequent sterilization process and then causing a problem with the patient. So what you described just puts it all together and makes it a whole lot more real. And a lot of those devices, well, not shavers necessarily, but there are a lot of devices too that are only hand wash. You can't necessarily disinfect them before they go in the sterilizer. There's limitations on it, but it got me thinking about a lot of things. And um, one thing I'd like to do, this is something I haven't done on the podcast before, but I'd like to share with you a few pictures from sterile processing and just kind of get your thoughts on it before we wrap up the podcast, just to see if you have any initial thoughts regarding these. And then hopefully you can see these on your screen right now. But this is a common one that we see where we have an irrigation system hooked up into the decontam sink. This is used, pressurized water to flush lumens. Obviously, there's some sediment there in the sink. So just tell us what your initial thoughts are when you see stuff like this in Central Sterile.
My initial thought is ick. But the more important thing is that obviously all of that residual deposit you see there is going to have bacterial contamination in it. And it is certainly, biofilm loves being combined with inorganic deposits. In the real, lime scale, uh, oxidation or corrosion product, all are happily mixed into the biofilm. The biofilm is a sticky substance. It loves all of that stuff, and it makes it even more challenging to get rid of. The bottom line on this is that, firstly, you should not really allow accumulation of debris in your sinks. You should be cleaning that out between each activity. And the other thing is, I would look very carefully at what you're using as a high pressure water source and making sure that is so adequately cleaned and sterile. Now, then we have our little drain in the bottom there, and I would also normally put a recommendation in that on a routine or regular basis, the drain is cleaned and disinfected. Um, the CDC has put forward recommendations for hand washing sinks. Don't think they've got as far as the central sterile processing area yet, but they have recommended that you clean the drain line on a hand washing sink with an EPA registered product that is effective against bacteria in biofilm. And we recommend that you use a foaming product because if you use a foaming product, then you can be confident that you're getting the necessary contact time. I've seen a lot of people just try and take some liquid disinfectant and pour it
Mm,
down in the hope that that will kill off whatever's in there. But you have no assurance that you're getting good solid
contact.
contact, and
That
you're not.
makes sense.
Yeah, so that would be our recommendation on that one.
No, that makes sense. And I remember that from your webinar, the products you were talking about and having a foam type one, which actually that same thoughts would probably apply to these ones. So I want to take you to my final ones that I had prepared. The one on the left here is, well, both of them are from an ultrasonic cleaner. Now, the one on the left, I don't know if you're able to see this well, but there's a little discoloration right around these ports, and there's a little discoloration here and here. There's some up here on the lid, and there's also discoloration over here on the lid, and it looks like, I don't know. I mean, it's what I imagine a biofilm, if it were visible, what it would look like. But I'm just curious what your thoughts or your take is on these photographs.
I would say that that is almost certainly a biofilm, a slime deposit. I would suggest that one of the newer tools that we have available to us is a four-channel UVA lamp, sorry, ultraviolet A-band light, um, which you can shine onto these surfaces. And you said if you could see biofilm, well, the advantage of this device is it allows you to actually see the biofilm. It glows under the UV light and you can see it. It shows
Oh,
up as a blue-green deposit and that will identify. Yes, looking at that, I would say just visually, those are more than likely biofilms. I can say those look like exactly the places that biofilm would happily grow. But I would be tempted to get my back to scan lamp out and go shine it at those surfaces and say yes or no, is that biofilm? And as a quality assurance tool, that is really something that is very useful. Uh, we use it in patient rooms to determine that the room was adequately cleaned and disinfected. You could use it here for the same thing. Has that sink been adequately cleaned between processing batches?
Yeah, I mean that is it, it's so almost like a cognitive dissonance. Like people just they see that discoloration, but they don't think it's any oh, it's rust or it's something else. But like if there's discoloration on your surfaces and you work in sterile processing where there is water and there is bacteria, you're gonna get this stuff that just starts settling in those places. And I really love like guys, go check out the webinar and just look at the toilet plume picture and it will terrify you and give you nightmares about what is going on in your toilet. But Mark, do you have any final thoughts for the listeners before we adjourn here?
Well, yeah, but I guess my final thought is that, you know, take a look at your environment, take a look around where you're working and what you're doing, and thinking about, you're putting all of that effort in to try and get things to be as safe as they possibly can be when you're doing your reprocessing. And isn't it a shame that just because you're not quite getting one little bit, you're not quite covering all the bases, you're not getting the result you want? Um, so, you know, let's make it a little bit easier for the guys who are doing this work. Let's give them the opportunity to do it right, and let's provide them with the right tools.
And that'll finalize this edition of the podcast. Mark, thank you again so much for coming onto the show, but also providing such a great international webinar for our audience. Just as one last reminder to all of you, if you're catching this podcast, please make your way to Healthmark Academy and check out the full webinar. I promise you will not be let down. It is a very good one, and I just want to say thanks again, Mark, and thanks to all you listeners out there. Keep subscribing and share the channel with others. We appreciate you.